Today is July 6, 2015. This is an interview with Ruth Hairston, and it takes place at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia, and the interviewer is Betsy Brinson. Today we'll be talking about your ancestor, Peter G. Morgan. How are you related to him?
Peter G. Morgan was my great-great-grandfather on my father's side.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And how did your family come to know the history of Peter Morgan?
In several ways. Some of that was just passed down through relatives, through various relatives on my father's side. A few things came to my attention while I was at St. Stephen's Church. There were other members of St. Stephen's Church who had attended St. Paul's College, and they knew about the link between my great-great-grandfather's daughter, Virginia Morgan, who had married James Solomon Russell, and they had founded that college there together in Brunswick County out of the St. Paul Church. So there were people at St. Stephen's who knew about that because they had either attended St. Paul's or they had known some of the Russells who were the founders, and they had shared some of what they knew about that. And of course that brought Peter into the picture because his daughter was married to the founder. And in other cases, my father shared what he knew of Peter from his father and his grandfather. So in those ways, I had basic beginning knowledge about him. I knew that he had existed. I didn't know as much specific information about him as I learned through my own research. My research began around 1991, just as a curiosity venture. There were questions that I had concerning who Peter Morgan actually was and how he had spent his life. And those questions caused me to do research. And it's been quite an adventure that has gone on for 22 years.
You certainly have a rich family history, and Peter Morgan is a wonderful example of that. When you and I talked by telephone briefly last week, we talked about the fact that he was also a participant in the Constitutional Convention following the end of the Civil War. And I wonder if there are any family stories that have been passed down about him during that experience. And of course then we'll move after that where he became a member of the House of Delegates. But the Constitutional Convention, anything about that?
I didn't receive much information about that through my father or any of his people, his father or grandfather, largely because I don't think that the information about that actually trickled down to my father. His own son, Albert A. Morgan, who was my great-grandfather, would have known, of course, what his father was doing because it would have been occurring during his adult lifetime. How much of it he actually handed down to my grandfather, I couldn't really know because my grandfather never discussed it with me. I had heard him briefly say that his grandfather had been a politician, but he didn't go into any details about the nature of that political career. So I was left to discover that on my own through some tedious research.
Well, I wonder if you have picked up on any of the things I have picked up. I've learned about Peter Morgan at the Constitutional Convention. For example, I believe he advocated for the poll tax, which in that era he would have thought would have been money to go for the public schools. And clearly Peter Morgan was a
Absolutely.
big supporter of education his entire life.
Absolutely, absolutely. He was a great proponent of getting legislation passed to have black teachers for those black children who were so newly out of slavery. Because, of course, you know that when slavery ended, there were teachers who came from the north, part of the Freedmen's Bureau, brought teachers in from the north, and they were white, but a good many blacks were concerned that black children might not respond too positively to someone who resembled their former owners. And so that was what the push and drive was all about, to try and find teachers for these children with whom they could more readily identify and possibly feel had their better interest at heart and so forth. So he did work very hard to get legislation passed to bring black teachers for black children. He also was instrumental in helping to get legislation passed for the founding of Virginia State College, that's now Virginia State University, Peabody High School as well. That's one of the oldest black high schools actually in Virginia, and possibly in the country, definitely in Virginia. And he was instrumental in working for that. He had also, on another tilt, he had also been appointed by the then President Rutherford B. Hayes as the tithe master, the deputy collector at City Point, which would have been in Hopewell at that time. And obviously he had some inroads or some fairly good connections to the state and national government to have come to the attention of the then president and to have received an appointment, because I understand that those positions were by appointment only, and so that worked.
Do you have any idea what his responsibilities were for that?
I wish I knew. I wish I knew. I've asked several persons, other researchers, and no one's been able to know if he manned a desk, copied information, or if he actually collected funds and was accountable for how those funds were distributed or how they were held and so forth. I don't know his specific duties. That remains to be researched.
Well, he's most unusual because he was a participant in the Constitutional Convention at first, then he was elected to the Virginia General Assembly, and then I believe after he finished his time in the legislature, he was elected to the Petersburg City Council.
Correct.
So many of the early members did one or the other, but your ancestor happened to be involved at a number of different levels. So he obviously saw public service as being important
Yes.
for him and for your family.
Yes.
Okay. I'm backing up here a little bit, but what do you think your ancestor contributed overall during his tenure in the General Assembly?
Basically, the legislations that he fought for concerned voting rights, basically for everyone, not just his own people, but for everyone, and educational advantages, definitely better schools, and as we said, black teachers for black children. At that time, many of the schools for black children were being operated out of the black churches, and his own daughter, Virginia, the one who had married James Solomon Russell, before she married Russell, she was a teacher in the school established at St. Stephen's, as well as the organist for the church. And Peter himself, having been a self-taught man, education was extremely important to him. And he did everything he could to try and improve the quality of that education for the persons who were in and around his community and across the state in which he lived. So he was a service-minded individual, very public service oriented, as well as having concerns for his own personal family and their betterment. So I believe that the political affiliations, the time in the legislature, it served as a catalyst to help him to achieve those ends for all of those persons that we've spoken of.
I think I just heard you say he was self-educated.
He was. That's definitely oral tradition, but I have seen it in one other historical document. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. It's among some papers that will be scanned, in which the writer explained that Peter Morgan, while he was still a slave, he attached a blueback speller to his plow. So while he plowed the fields, he taught himself the alphabet, the basics of reading, and moved on to the basics of writing and basics of arithmetic. And the person who wrote that book explained that for a person of his generation, that he had a relatively good self-acquired education. And one other book explained that he had the largest personal library of any black person in the city of Petersburg. And I found that interesting too, because I guess a love of learning, a love of books just might be something that trickles down through your DNA, because I had noticed that all of my father's people loved reading. They were book lovers, belonging to book clubs, et cetera, et cetera. And in my case, I was such a book lover, I became a librarian. And so I think it trickled down, and I found that interesting about him. He did maintain that interest all of his life, and he served as a benefactor of sorts to his daughter and his son-in-law at St. Paul's College. They credited him with having made donations to the college over time. And
I think I saw one reference where he actually was a trustee of the college. So they obviously thought he had a role to play there.
Absolutely. He had served as trustee also for some properties that were, for whatever reasons, were put into his wife's name. That might have been a move that he made because he felt conscious of being in a dangerous position as a political person during Reconstruction days. The country was not quite settled down or totally over the war, so to speak. The war had ended, of course, but the results of the war were not necessarily satisfactory to everyone. And so being aware of that, I think he might have felt that it was important to secure some personal properties by putting them into his wife's name and making himself trustee over them, just in case anything happened to him. You can confiscate a man's property, but you can't take what belongs to his wife under some statutes.
I wonder, given his love of learning and his book collection, makes me think, Did he have a mentor, or did he have people who inspired him, that maybe he knew them personally, or maybe he read about them in books? Have you ever come across or heard any stories about that?
So far, I have not actually found a mentor. He was apprenticed to a shoemaker early on, before he actually was freed. I don't know what he might have thought of the person to whom he was apprenticed, whether he admired him or in some way received some type of encouragement from him beyond learning the craft of shoemaking. There simply isn't any documentation of any sort, and I haven't heard any stories of who might have inspired him, but it leaves you to speculate. And of course, as I do that speculation, I can't help thinking that if you, out of your own experience of being a slave, all of the hardships that you encounter and all of the things that you encounter because you see that there are certain things missing, the lack of an education makes you unable to fend for yourself or to work your way out of a bad set of circumstances. So you might simply resolve within yourself that I'm going to learn everything I can about those things, the education, the reading, the writing, the arithmetic, those things that seem to be key to living well as a free person, or even to actually gaining my freedom, that I would need to have these skills. Some of these things might have simply come to him out of his own situation, and you are determined to better yourself, and you realize this would be the way to do that.
You mentioned the violence of the era and needing to protect yourself in it, and in fact there are stories around the Constitutional Convention experience where some of the participants, what we know is that they were threatened.
Oh yes.
They were attacked.
Yes.
Did you ever hear of any sort of physical violence of that sort that your ancestor might have encountered?
I remember only one story that was shared actually as late as this morning through Benjamin Todd Jellis, who he was interviewed by Gates on Finding Your Roots, and in that interview he shared a story that had come down to him of how while Peter was active as a legislator, he was also running a store. He ran a saloon of sorts, and I haven't been able to determine if by saloon exactly what sort of saloon, but he was listed as a storekeeper. And a man of some means came in upset about some recent legislation that had been passed, and apparently he knew that Peter was involved in having that legislation passed, so he was a bit irate. He came into Peter's store and began to berate him for the outcome of that legislation, and Peter simply turned to his son and said, "Put him out of here." Literally pick him up and toss him out of here. And that was a man of some standing in the community. And to me, knowing the history of the types of violence that took place in those days, and even as late as today, that was rather bold. And there was no indication that any other repercussions came out of that. So perhaps the tossing out won some sort of respect. Certainly didn't want to be tossed out again, but it also did not mean that Peter's family, his wife and children, were immune to attack.
So he needed to be concerned about their protection
Absolutely.
as well as his own.
Absolutely.
Of course.
It was a turbulent time.
What do you think, how does your family describe the overall accomplishments of Peter Morgan to Virginia history? When they get together or when you have a family reunion, if you talk about him, do different members have different things that they appreciate about him the most? Or?
I believe that from just out of my personal experience with other members of my family, there haven't actually been a great many Morgan reunions. The event that we are enjoying this weekend is actually one of the most extensive reunions that I know of. And because so little had actually known about him by the family in terms of really specific details, I haven't been able to glean what stands out for them, because many of them are finding out specifics as a result of the research that I've done. So it's rather new to them. The specifics are new to them. Most of them are, in a very generalized way, aware that they had an ancestor whose name was Peter G. Morgan, who had served on the Virginia legislature. And they group the two bodies as, they simply say the Virginia legislature. They don't even make a distinction between the two groups, the convention and the delegates from Virginia, because their knowledge has been that sketchy.
So you've played a very important role in your family in terms of doing the research and compiling it and sharing it.
That is my hope.
Yes,
that is my hope. I was motivated because as a child growing up, I would hear little pieces and patches of information that I couldn't be certain about their source or the validity, and I wanted to know for myself who was this man and why does everyone seem to know about him but not know much about him? Why do they know his name and they know his connection to the family, but they're not able to give me any details about his life? And I set out to find out what I could about his life. And that's been like putting a huge puzzle together and a great adventure. It's been a wonderful adventure for me. And I don't want future generations to have to do the legwork in the old-fashioned way that I had to, because at the time when I started, Ancestry.com was not up and running as it is today, and I simply jumped in both feet and just did it the old-fashioned way. And by the time Ancestry.com came to my attention, I had pretty much covered the territory.
Thank you very much for talking with us.
You're so welcome.